We've got a number of Kurdish people in the audience tonight, including Nader Gariban. Do you think what you're hearing shows that Australia is willing to muscle up to the United States and say if it thinks the US has done the wrong thing? Do you think the United States has done the wrong thing on leaving Northern Syria?
Well, I don't think that the United States has done the wrong thing. I think Trump has done the wrong thing. I should say we thank the United States for the help that they provide us during this war. But what Mr. Trump has done is absolutely, I don't see any justification in there. Because today I was just listening to one of his speeches that he was saying that we can't even protect our southern border. How can we protect you guys over there? Well, if this is the case, how come you call yourself the leader of this world? How come you sent 3,500 soldiers to Saudi Arabia just a couple of days ago?
So the United States relied on the Kurds in northern Syria to fight against ISIS. They were an important ally. How do the Kurds now view President Trump as an ally?
Well, we feel betrayed. That is the word that we use. I don't think that the decision that he's made is in the interest of anyone, including the United States. He could have kept 50 soldiers there. That would have been enough to prevent Turkey and their sort of jihadist people to advance to the Kurdish area.
Do you think, Tim Wilson, that President Trump has betrayed the Kurds?
I think he's left him in an incredibly difficult position. Now, I don't think I can actually say whether that's how he feels, obviously, and I can understand. I don't actually think as not being part of that community that I can project that, but I do think he's left him in an incredibly difficult situation, and that's why I'm extremely concerned. But as I keep coming back, there's obviously the decision of Turkey, which is very disturbing. There's obviously the role and the influence that the European Union could be playing in this theatre, and there's also the role of the United States, and as you say, your criticisms toward President Trump. And I'm concerned about all three parties.
Simon Longstaff?
President Trump has betrayed the Kurds. He's been having conversations with Erdogan for months now about Turkey's desire to go into that area. They've been playing chicken with each other. It was President Trump's decision alone, and this is in relation to people who have sacrificed a huge amount as the shock troops to take on and defeat ISIS, albeit with Allied support, but they're the ones who are on the ground. And they had reasons to believe, they should have been able to believe that they could trust in some of their allies, particularly the most important of all, to stay true to the sacrifice that they'd made.
They were given some guarantees.
Yeah, whether the guarantees were written in blood or on ink, it doesn't matter. They were given it. That's a betrayal. And I fear that that part of the world. Now, what's the consequences? You've got people escaping from the camps, going back into ISIS strongholds. You've had the Kurdish community driven back into the arms of Assad and the Russians. I mean, how you can justify this on strategic grounds or any others baffles me. But the human cost for those communities of people who are now under threat is terrible. And I think betrayal is the only word that fairly describes it.
Well, yeah, I think it does describe it. It's not the first time, of course, that this has happened, and no one is going to say that dealing with Middle East politics is anything other than horrendous most of the time, with all sorts of grave human consequences and destruction much of the time. There was, of course, an issue with the US saying, look, we don't want to keep going on over here all the time, don't want to be here. But I think in this case it's very obvious, including from the incredible criticism of Trump's decision by many of his own party and many of his strong supporters, that this is in fact a grave strategic error, quite apart from the human catastrophe involved. And that is, I think, one of the problems that you see with this president, that he has been willing to pull out from allies, pull the rug out from allies so frequently, and certainly the Kurds are not alone in that.
Is it possible in that context to separate Trump from the United States, as has been done multiple times this evening? He's the leader of the United States.
Well, yes, of course he is, but I mean, the US is made up of many people of different opinions, and you'd find no more fierce critics of him than other Americans, including, of course, the Democrats.
If the alliance is between peoples, I mean, that didn't stand for much for the Kurds, did it?
Well, no, but I mean, as Tim also said, I mean, these things do extend past precedents. But in this particular case, in terms of the relationship with a country like Australia, for example, I think in this particular case, of course, the Kurds would feel betrayed, and I do think it's actually against US interests, which many of Trump's strongest supporters have made clear.
Our next question is a video from Giselle Hall, an Australian filmmaker and former aid worker who's just crossed out of Syria into Iraqi Kurdistan.
Hi, my question is about the Australian women and children stranded in camps in Northern Syria. Our government was warned again and again about the human rights and security risks of leaving people in these camps, and they failed to act. Now it seems like a worst-case scenario is unfolding, where adults who could have faced the justice system are escaping, and children who could have been safely brought home are in grave danger. Given these latest developments, how is the Australian government planning to fulfil its obligations to these Australian children who are in this situation through no fault of their own?
We will come to Tim Wilson in a moment, but Simon Longstaff, this is an incredibly difficult moral question for Australia, isn't it?
In some ways, it's a very easy question, I think. You've got Australian citizens, I'm thinking here particularly of the children that Giselle's just spoken of, who through no fault of themselves find themselves exposed before this event, and particularly now after the event, to what I think would for most of us be unimaginable danger. And I understand why the government was trying to be cautious in its treatment of these people, but there was always a reasonable prospect of harm befalling these people. And I think, on balance, most Australians would say the adults should be held to account for the decisions that they've made. We should take responsibility for them, our fellow citizens, and hold them for account here within our justice system. It's been set up to do that, and particularly do that so that those children are not exposed to danger. That's why I think it's a fairly straight answer to such a question, that's what we ought to have done. And people might say, oh, well, it's hard to tell, and it's all very well now, me saying this with the benefit of hindsight. But I think those principles could have been applied prospectively.
Tim Wilson, is it that simple?
Well, it's never that simple, but the spirit of the comment around children not being held accountable for the conduct of their parents, I agree with. The challenge and the technical challenge we've always faced is making sure we protect the security of every Australian in managing this situation. And so what the government has said and will continue to do is to work through the issue and to make sure that Australia's security isn't compromised in the process of confronting it. There's been no hard decisions that have been made. It's working through each individual case to do what we can do to protect Australia and protect Australian citizens.
Don't we have to take some risks for the sake of those children? I mean, I don't think be foolish about it, but we could have brought them back under secure conditions. They could have been...
And these are exactly the sorts of considerations that are being weighed up to make sure that we protect the interests of Australians who are here, while also making sure we deal with and confront with those challenges. Now, the individual case...
So what, there appeared to be a window of opportunity to do that. Why wasn't it done?
Well, respectfully, you'd have to ask that question to the Minister, because obviously I'm not involved in that decision-making. But what the clear focus is to try and do what we can do for Australian citizens in the circumstances that present themselves. Of course, we didn't send that opportunity may have gone. Well, we didn't send those people there, as you know. And the situation that particularly the children are in is not the consequence of the Australian government. We have choices we have to make about how we manage this situation. It has to be done on the basis of protecting every Australian as well as considering the interests of those people.
Do you accept that it may in fact be much harder and more dangerous to do now than it was a week ago?
Yes, I do accept that.
Jennifer Hewitt, what's your view on this?
Well, I think it's, as usual, whenever you talk about the Middle East, one of those incredibly complicated situations where I don't think it is quite as easy as Simon said. And
the ethical question is, maybe the practicality.
Well, the practical question is what governments tend to deal with, I think.
But why is it practically so difficult?
I think it was quite difficult to go in and rescue the children and then figure out what to do with their parents, their mothers usually, and I think the moment's been lost anyway. But it was not a simple, oh, we'll just go in and get them and then come out again and everything will be all right. And then you do have the idea of what would happen to the parents in Australia. I think they would go through the justice system. They would certainly be separated from their mother, if that's what you would actually think is important.
There are former jihadists back in Australia now. They've been put through the court system. Is it a problem necessarily to have them here and treat them in that way?
To treat the adult jihadists, treat them well. I think it's just another thing that which will end up in jail. Most of them, I would imagine. If you're saying that should the mothers have been brought out to face the justice system because of their children, along with their children, yes, I think they probably should have been. But again, it was not. It had to be dealt with, I think, in a way that was quite practically difficult and took time. I do think many of the countries whose citizens were there acting as jihadists do have responsibility to take them back and deal with them that way. But I just think this idea that it's, that was somehow the fault of the Australian government that they were there and that these children are put in this situation is also not reasonable.
Vicky Shu, how do you view this? Do you think Australia has some responsibility for these children particularly to bring them back here?
Absolutely. I don't think Australia should leave its citizens stateless. And as a matter of fact, there is a very high possibility that these camps will be captured by the Assad government, which not only regularly but also systematically tortures people. And this is not something we want to see that happen to Australian citizens, no matter what their belief systems are.
What would happen, Tim Wilson, if these people fell into the hands of the Syrian government and were kept in a prison there? What would our responsibility be then?
Well, our responsibility would what it is now, which is we have to confront the practical reality of a situation we haven't created. My hope, obviously, is that every Australian citizen is safe. But going back to the point, we have to do it in a way that works through the challenge here, because the big concern that the government has, and it's not just one that's randomly political or partisan, it's the challenge we have where people have gone off into conflict in areas where there are failed states, where there may not be the evidence to deal with issues around crimes and where they've been committed, and making sure they go through proper processes when they return home. Now, sometimes we can do that, but sometimes we don't have that information. That's why we have a rich, complex area of laws that deal with the issues around foreign fighters and everything else. And what we don't want is people to come through because, of course, not unreasonably, should that situation arise and emerge, people will say, what did you do about it? Why did you allow this situation to create itself? So these are... Jen's right. The practicalities are extremely complicated, and we've got to make practical decisions about what's in the best interest of keeping every Australian safe.
Tim Watts, it's often easier, I suppose, to solve things from opposition, but do you see a solution here?
Well, Hamish, I think the important point that Giselle made was that this is something we've seen coming for quite some time. Aid groups on the ground there, like Save the Children, have been talking to parliamentarians and warning us that the window to safely extract these people would close. It seems like the present situation, the complexity of the status of these people is dramatically worse now.
And do you think that window has closed?
It's impossible for me to say from opposition, Hamish. I have even less information than Tim on this. I should say, though, I don't think anyone is trying to say that this is the government's fault that these people are in this situation. I think the argument here is that we do have an obligation to Australian citizens, children, who by no fault of their own find themselves in this situation. I mean, we'd want an Australian government to look after our own children if they were in this situation.
But what can the government do now?
Well, it seems that the options are becoming fewer and fewer, Hamish, but that's why I say that the point Giselle made is that there may well have been a time in the past where there are more options available. Tim and I both voted for a number of pieces of legislation designed to facilitate the return of people from these areas, to put criminals on trial, put them in jail, which I don't know how that you could be any more safe, any more secure than jailing jihadists. It seems like a good response to me. There are also a range of provisions for control orders and surveillance and keeping an eye on people that we're not too sure about. So the infrastructure was there. It just hasn't happened before that window closed, it seems. All right.